Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show issue number 58.
Boom!
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
How you doing, everybody? Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show issue number 59. And Steve, how you doing, brother? What's going on?
I'm doing very good, surviving 114-degree heat, but we are surviving here in Las Vegas.
Oh, yeah. And before we get to the guy down below here and today's show, let's get rid of the elephant in the room. We've been having a big impact on little Niall. And what do you see that's strange now? I see Carl Crusher Creel. What else? I see who's that Morlock? That big Morlock that's down below there. What was his name? Sunder. I see there's another
I'm
down below
actually seeing, if you take off the glasses, more of a Stone Cold Steve Austin's bonds right there. There you go. Boom.
Oh, I got that. I actually got that quite a bit.
Yes.
Yeah. You're like a cute Stone Cold Steve Austin, like a plush toy Stone Cold Steve Austin.
I was trying to go for a Mr. Houston look, you know? That's what, you know? Back at the gym, clean, ready to go.
God, he's going to come in at 280 pounds. He's going to be,
wow.
Yeah, he's coming in.
So, Niall, what's going on, brother?
Oh, you know what's going on, but first and foremost, everyone knows the house rules. Look below, click that subscribe button, and smash the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome episodes like tonight's episode. And gentlemen, I'm ready to chat some comics.
Ooh, yeah, we are going to chat. Steve, we got a special guest today that probably, like I said, although I shave my head, I do have a full head of hair. But I will say that this guy that's coming on has a better hair than all of us combined. All of us combined. So what do we have to say about today's guest, Steve? What do you think?
Now, this is a fascinating guest because this show, it likes to dig deep into the personalities of certain eras. And if you were reading Marvel Comics, specifically in the mid-1980s, and you were looking through the credit box, every now and again, on the more weird little titles, I don't know if anyone ever remembers a title called the Strike Force Morituri.
Yeah.
When I was flicking through, I would see this name. I would see one of the editors or assistant editor or editor, and it was like, who is Mr. Carl Potts? I always used to wonder, who is Mr. Carl Potts? You know, always an editor, never went, I didn't see any writing. And I was like, wow, who are these people? This show today, we are going to get into the weeds. We're going to get down in there and see who is Mr. Carl Potts.
Now, I have to say, the first time I heard of that name is anybody that was collecting during the 90s. Now, this is your territory, can always remember the anticipation for, oh my God, it was everywhere for what? Punisher War Journal 6 and 7. Like, that was like, I remember it in the previews. I remember it in the, what was that little newspaper? What was that little newspaper called, Steve? Comic Shop News.
Comic Shop News. Wow, you really are old. You're ancient, my friend.
Oh my God!
You mean wizard? What?
But I tell you, I'll never forget that. And looking back, after studying a little on this guy, then looking back, and my God, Alien Legion. I mean, like I I remember that. I remember seeing the ads for that. But what was I think I was telling Niall today, what was the Kevin Smith movie where they talk about Punisher War Journal 6 and 7? Because I think Jason had to get the other one of his friends still had it at his house. Do you remember what movie that one was? Was it the second one? Was it Clerks? No, or maybe Chasing Amy.
Mallrats?
Yeah, Mallrats. That was the first one, correct?
Well, it wasn't his first movie.
Okay, but it was Mallrats. It had to be that one.
Yeah.
But they mentioned Punisher War Journal 6 and 7. That just shows you how popular it was. It was in the ether, and that had to be. I don't know. Maybe Steve, you would know this better than me. And I'll probably have to ask Carl this, but that had to be one of the best-selling comics of the '90s, especially just the cover and all that alone. I wonder what the sales were on that, because I just remember the anticipation for it. That had to sell.
Yeah, it was a massive book, and of course we ordered a tremendous amount for our store, but it'll be fascinating to know if Carl knows exactly what the numbers were. Did he get up to 500,000, 750,000? I'm dying to know myself.
Yeah. So without further ado, now what do we got to do?
Let's bring in Mr. Carl Potts.
Hello, guys.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Mr. Potts, and thank you for coming on our show. It's always a pleasure. I met you first now just at a recent Heroes that we were at, and fell in love with you right off the bat. And it was great because, once again, I recognized your work and stuff, and then I could see the man, and it was like, I was collecting during the '90s, obviously the '80s too, but your work is a part of the ether here. I mean, you're like a Rick Hoberg. You've done so much and you have so much out there, but sometimes people can't piece the name and the work together. And it's just like, oh yeah, that's Carl Potts. Oh my God, yeah, that's him. Like, you have that. And so hopefully with today's podcast, what we can do is, make it a little clear for people and put the man, the myth, the legend, and his work together, because that's what we like to do. And so, Carl, first off, once again, thank you for being here. But obviously, we start off all this stuff like a lot of podcasts, but to get a little background information. Little Carl Potts, what was he doing back then, and how did he get into the business?
Well, I was born and for the most part raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, the East Bay, and like almost everybody else at the time, probably as soon as I get up Saturday morning, watch a few cartoons, go mow the lawn, take the few coins I got from my dad for that, go down to the variety store, buy a comic and a candy bar. And I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading comics at some point. My parents were very progressive, even when comics were like kind of demonized for a while. They thought anything that encouraged me to read was just fine by them. I mean, they weren't buying me the EC horror stuff, but when I was buying my own comics, I started out reading mostly the DC war books. The art was very polished. You had Kubert and Irv Novick and Russ Heath and people like that on that work. And one day I went with my father into the PX in Alameda, and I see Sergeant Fury #1. And this is like the wonkiest World War II book I've ever seen in my life. I had to pick it up and check it out. So I take it home and I read it, and it is like nothing else. But what was strange is that I didn't really care for the art style, but every day I'd find myself going back to the drawer, pulling it out and reading it again. It wasn't until I was older that I realized it was the dynamics and the visual storytelling that had me hooked. Again, I didn't really care for the actual drawing style Kirby was using, but boy, could he tell a story, and boy, was it dynamic. But then I started seeing the house ads for other Marvel books, and that's when I got into the rest of those, and particularly the Ditko stuff. Ditko was my first big artistic influence, and I was drawing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange all the time. When I got in high school, I think it was my junior year, I was doing some sort of big figure in the art class, and my art teacher asked me where I learned anatomy, and I said, Steve Ditko. I don't think he knew what I was talking about. But at some point, I realized that, there were real people doing this stuff and they're somehow making a living. I wonder if that's viable for me. When I got to college, I didn't really know what had three things I could go into that I was really interested in. One was aquatic biology and ichthyology. The other was music, and the other was art. And I started out music and then switched to commercial art. Somewhere on Earth, 3,420, I became a marine biologist, and all the comic stuff never happened. But I got to know at some of the local conventions. My first convention was actually the San Diego Con, the third San Diego Con. This is how old I am. 1973 at a motel near San Diego Airport. And the big guests were Neil Adams and Carmine Infantino.
Wow.
And I didn't realize at the time, because there was no social media or anything, but there were a handful of other would-be comic artists that were in the Bay Area that I didn't meet till I ran into them in San Diego, including Steve Lealoa and Al Gordon from the San Francisco side. And from the South Bay was Frank Sirocco, Brent Anderson, Gary Winnick, and a little later, Joe Chido. And so we started all connecting from that. And there were conventions locally in the Bay Area. And that's where I met several pros from New York that had moved to the Bay Area. They liked it there. They were established enough that they were allowed to work via mail. And those were mostly, for the most part, I was dealing with Jim Starlin and Alan Weiss. And they eventually asked me to help them out on an emergency job. They had to pencil an issue of Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter over a 4-day weekend for Denny O'Neil. I guess someone had let Denny down. So they asked me to help out. And then I very naively decided that in the summer of 75, I was going to move to New York to try and really break in. And first off, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember, but 75 was a horrible year to try and break into comics. That's when Atlas died, and all the people that had run off to Atlas are now running back to Marvel and DC to get work. So this is the thing I walk into, and but I didn't know anybody there. And Starlin asked me before I left, did I know anybody in New York? And I said no. I was really naive. This kid from the California burbs, moving to New York City. And so he calls up Milgram and Simonson are sharing an apartment in Forest Hills and says, if this kid comes out there, will you put him up for a while until he gets his feet on them? And they said, sure. They didn't know me. So I move out there, and these guys turn out to be great. They're a couple of my best friends out here still. But living in the same building are Chaikin and Wrightson. So I'm like this geeky kid from California with a portfolio of very weak samples, by the way. And I'm hanging out with Chaikin, Wrightson, Simonson, Milgram. And then Starlin came out a day or two later to, he would occasionally come back to New York to set up his next jobs or gigs, talk to editors. And he took me up to Marvel and introduced me to Archie Goodwin, who at that point was in charge of the Marvel Black and White magazines. And Archie was looking through my portfolio, and there's a science fiction piece I did, and he goes, I can use this for the subscription ad for my science fiction magazine. I'll have Walt Simonson ink it. I was happy with that. So he gives me all the forms to fill out to get paid, vouchers and all that. And while I'm doing that, his secretary walks out with a stack of unsolicited submissions that they'd received over the previous months with the rejection letters that the assistant had typed up ready for Archie to sign. And on the top of the stack are the samples I'd sent in a few months before with my rejection letter on it. So while I'm filling out the form to get paid for my first bit of Marvel, Archie looks down, sees this, smiles, signs it, the rejection letter, and hands it to me. And that was my introduction to Archie's sense of humor. Then Jim Starlin took me to the British reprint department. At that point, that was all in New York. And they'd split the comics in half for the British weekly market. So the second halves needed new splash pages, and they'd sometimes try new people out on those. So I walked out of there with a handful of those, but I didn't find out till years later that the only reason I got those was that the editor took Starlin aside out of my earshot and said, "I'll give this kid some work if you do a cover for me." Starlin did that, never told me. I had to learn that from Milgram years later.
Oh, wow.
So, in case you can't guess, Starlin's got major brownie points in my book. But I going back a bit to San Diego, that first one, 73, I showed my work to Neil Adams, and he kind of paged through it and handed the pages back to me and turned around and walked away and said, "That's not even worth commenting on." So I was like in shock. I somehow stammered out, "Well, can you at least tell me what to work on?" And he pivoted back around and proceeded to name every aspect of comics there was. And then he said, "If you work really hard for at least 18 months, I'll be willing to look at your work again." So when I moved to New York 2 years later, I called up Continuity and I went in there and showed them my work. And they were gearing up to package 3 black and white magazine comics for Charlton based on $6 Million Man, Emergency in Space, 1999. And they were hiring some new guys to pencil a lot of those. And I was the last one that they hired. So while all the rest of the industry was scrambling because Atlas had gone under, I somehow bumbled into this gig of doing this work. And I ended up working for a number of years, sitting at a little desk to the left of Neil Adams' desk, which was inspiring and depressing simultaneously when you look over and go, but eventually I started getting into writing as well as drawing. And then in early 83, I get a call out of the blue from Jim Shooter, who's editor-in-chief at Marvel. And he says, "Al Milgram's going to leave the editorial staff to go full-time writing and drawing. And I don't think any of my current crop of assistants are ready to promote yet. I want to talk to you about being an editor here." And I was flabbergasted because I'd never thought about that job and I'd never talked to anybody about it. But apparently when he started asking around for suggestions, a few people, Milgram and I believe Sienkiewicz, again, I'd never talked to either of them about doing editing, and they suggested me. And so I gave it a shot and ended up being there for 13 years. And the only downside of that is that I was never like a particularly fast artist, but while editing, it was almost impossible for me to produce any real body of artwork. I would do things here and there, some covers and so on. I did the layouts for most of the covers I was editing for a number of years. And sometimes the people who did the finished art would throw my initials in there. And that was either because they wanted to give me credit or they didn't want to take credit for the layout they didn't like. I'm not sure which. But it was a blast for most of the 13 years. I'd say at least 10 of them, maybe 10 and a half, where it was the best work environment I've ever encountered. And particularly during the years when I was working with Tom DeFalco as the editor-in-chief. Tom promoted me to executive editor. First, Mark Grunwald was the first executive editor. Then I got added, and then Bob Vidianz got added. So eventually the three of us, because Marvel kept growing and the number of books being put out, the three of us basically each oversaw a third of the editors and the output Marvel was putting out. And Tom was the overall chief. Above Tom was Mike Hobson, who's a name a lot of people don't know, but Mike Hobson was a great guy. He was the publisher. And then above him was the president, Jim Galton, who was also a great guy. The combination of those three people leading the company created a really good example. And them combined with Mark Grunwald, who was kind of the heart and soul of the Marvel and the fun of Marvel. They were just, a lot of us were kind of introverts by nature, but, someone like Mark, he was so enthusiastic about, organizing things and all of us doing things together and, making fools of ourselves at conventions with the Marvel Olympics and stuff like that. It's like, I would never be caught dead doing that. But we, those of us who are interviewed, the idea of disappointing Mark, we couldn't do that. It was a blast for a long time. I wish it could have lasted even longer. But what can you do?
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, that's definitely a fascinating opening. And of course, we've had Howard here talking, and we are very well versed in Mr. Grunwald and Tom DeFalco. So now that we've been going for a while, when someone comes in and starts talking, their story slots nicely in with their stories.
Yeah.
So we're beginning to build a nice picture. So it's quite fascinating to see.
Yeah.
So obviously, you're there for the transition from Mr. Jim Shooter to Mr. Tom DeFalco. And, we've talked with Tom before about this. But from your point of view,
Steve, you froze.
The Iceman. Got shot with Iceman. I think if I'm correct, I think what he wants to know is that how was that transition between Jim Shooter and going into DeFalco? Because even talking to DeFalco about that, because I know from his perspective, but two distinct, different personalities.
Yeah, definitely. Jim's a hard one to talk about because he did a lot of really good things. He hired me. But he almost fired me, and I almost quit a few times too. But he's really, kind of have contradictory feelings about him. He did a lot of good stuff, but he also, especially towards the latter part of his reign there, really went off the rails, I thought, and it was sad. And then we had in the editor-in-chief's office was along the wall was this big metal radiator housing, and it ran all the way down editorial row. So Shooter and I don't think DeFalco knew at the time either, but basically it was like a telegraph. We could hear pretty much the arguments those two were having.
That's awesome.
And we could hear how much crap Tom was taking. He was kind of taking a hit for the team. And at one point, I remember you were talking about New Universe before they. Tom and Ron Friends had created Kickers Inc. And within like an issue and a half, they were off the book because they couldn't deal with all of the rigmarole that was going on with Shooter. And it ended up being the latest book, I think, in Marvel history. This thing was so far beyond the 8 ball. And whoever the editors had been on it had like half of the planet of wannabes writing and drawing various issues to try and catch up. And I was known as an editor who was really good with keeping their books on the schedule. So Shooter told Tom to assign me Kickers Inc. So he told Tom to assign the book he created and was forced off of to me, force feed it to me, because that's what my reward for having my books on time is, being force fed this book. But again, we'd heard all this stuff going through the radiators, and we knew that Tom was just, this was like the worst thing you could do. So I didn't give him any shit. I just said, okay. And I did the best I could. At that point, there were so many stories in the works by all these different people. We couldn't eat them all. So best I could do was try and get, people like John Buscema and Wells Pertassi and so on to do covers on it. And Mignola, I think, did one. But I got it on the ideal schedule just in time for them to pull the plug on almost all the whole line of those things. But it was a real breath of fresh air when Tom came in as the editor-in-chief. He and Hobson were both the kind of bosses I like, and I like to try to be, which is, even if you have a different opinion about something, you can have a straightforward conversation about it, present your case, and have an honest shot at convincing them of your point of view. And if they decide that they need to do something other than that, it's not because they're pulling a power play or some, petty thing. It's what they honestly feel is the best thing to do. And that they have the confidence in me that even though I don't particularly agree with it, I'm not going to half-ass it. I'm going to do my best to try and make their decision work. And that to me is like the best professional setup you can have. And that's what all of us had with Tom.
Yeah, you could tell, like, you know, now I know Tom very well, and I consider him a great close friend. But you could see, like, what, like, once again, the dynamic between personalities. Like, Tom was a people person. Like, I can see that, and he has that thing about him. Like, you want to be around him. Like, he has a very likable quality. Like I said, it had to be so different. I think he was, and he I think he was good for that position because, when before I ever met Tom, I was always in question. I always knew his accolades, but I was always like, how was he after Shooter? But then now getting to know him, you can see that he has that warmth about him that, like, I can see, like, what he wants, and there's no ego with Tom too. It had to be such a different end of the spectrum, from Shooter.
Some of the things that Shooter did that I don't know if he gets enough credit for on the plus side is that he helped get the company to start doing things like pay, to pay for the art supplies for people that were working on the books, and if they were on a full-time contract, that they would get benefits like an employee would, that sort of thing. And he also had this really good talk he did that was based on an old Jack Kirby Strange Tales comic where the Torch meets a fake Captain America. And he had a really good analysis of the visual storytelling on that. So often I like to discover and mentor a lot of talent. And often I'd have them come, those new people, if they were in New York, arrange time for them to go in and get that talk from Shooter, because it was really, I think, educational for them to do that. But one of the things the first thing that kind of made me wonder, a little bit about, the good stuff with Shooter being balanced with the bad stuff is that, do you guys remember the Marvel Triumph book?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Big one.
Reading that, who would you think created that?
That's probably Shooter. I would think, maybe, because that's in my head. That would probably, because that would go to him. He would be the guy to look at that. But
what happened is Louise Simonson had the idea, and she came to me because she knew I liked mentoring new talent, and said, "Well, you work on this with me, and we'll go pitch it to Shooter." So we did, and he said, "Yeah, this is great, but I want to put my book out there on storytelling first, which is basically take that lecture I was just telling you about and put it in a book form." And short time later, within a week or two, I think, there was a big editorial meeting, and he starts talking about this great new idea he has for a Marvel Trap book. And I, like an idiot, I spoke up and said, "You mean Wheezy's idea?" And I got one of those, stare down looks from on high. That was pretty intimidating. And I was really steamed, and the meeting was over right after that. And I was so steamed. Wheezy basically kept me from getting fired by calming me down, using what Ralph Macchio refers to as the Wheezy effect. She can calm down a charging rhino if she wants to. But she basically saved my career there.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Wow. Go ahead now.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about, enjoying mentoring a lot of, creators and up and comers that were coming in. Can you tell us what it was like working? I know you worked with Jim Lee, Will Spartaccio, Adam Hughes and stuff. I mean, how was it?
Not Adam Hughes, I wish.
I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, Arthur Adams. Sorry.
Yeah,
Arthur Adams. But how was it working with these guys as they were coming into Marvel?
It was a lot of extra work. It was like editing at least another monthly book, but it was very fulfilling too, because what happened is that I remembered what it was like sending on my unsolicited samples and either not getting a response or ages later getting a form letter back that usually said nothing useful. And so I decided that, okay, if I'm going to be an editor, every submission that comes to me, I'm going to give them a prompt response and tell them something useful. I also felt it was very bad marketing on Marvel's part to let these things just sit around forever and then eventually just get a form letter back, because these are your most ardent fans. They love you so much, they want to be a part of you.
Yeah.
and you're just sitting there letting their stuff collect dust. That's nuts. That's also, I mean, ethically that's weird, but also as a marketing thing, it's pitiful. So my first day on the job, for that first week, Milgram stayed there and helped train me to get my feet under me. And the first day on the job, we're going through the stacks of submissions that had piled up in his office. And my first day on the job, I discovered Art Adams in the stack of stuff. It wasn't a bad start. So that was good reinforcement to keep up that vow. And then at conventions, I would often, for hours and hours, just look at portfolio after portfolio. And sometimes in San Diego, in particular, these lines out the door, people wanting to show something to a Marvel editor. And it'd be there forever, far longer than you were supposed to be stationed there. But I knew what it would have been like to be at the end of that line and have some poor tired editor say enough and leave before my turn came up. So I tried to always wait it out until the end. But my first San Diego in '83 with the Marvel team, that's when all the editors went out there together. And that's when I discovered Will Spertasio. He showed me his work there. Other people would, like eventually when Jim Lee came along, Jim had, there was a convention in New York, I think at the Roosevelt Hotel, and Jim had been going to Princeton, and he really wanted to do comics. So he brought his samples in, but he was too shy to show anybody until the show was closing. And almost all the editors were gone except for Archie Goodwin. And he shows his samples to Archie, and Archie says, well, you really showed them to Carl. He's a guy who likes to work with new talent. So I don't know if he was out of college yet or if he quit or if he's cut class on Monday. And he came in and showed me his work. And what I would do with new talent like that showed a lot of promise is I would give him the same 6-page story. It was actually a DeFalco story called Double Vision, which Tom told me when he initially wrote it, the editor he did it for said, this is far too much packed into 6 pages. No one can do this. So Tom proved him wrong by doing little thumbnails. And eventually it was assigned to somebody that got published. It didn't do a very good job, but I thought it was really good, like kind of throw them into deep into the pool test to see how well their storytelling and drawing is. So everybody would take that plot and they would do layouts for it. I'd go over the layouts, do overlays, and talk to them on the phone about it, and then have them do revisions. Then when the storytelling was right, I'd have them do the final pencils, and I'd give them feedback on that. And eventually, if they want ink, go over that or save those pencils for an inker to try out on. And eventually, my office started being running almost like a professional baseball team. My pros were working on my monthly titles. My AAA people were working on miniseries or one-shots or annual stories or things like that. And my AA folks were working on this Vision tryout story. And what often would happen is eventually someone would get popular enough that they'd be stolen by the X-Men office. And instead of me having to go down to someone else's office, try and steal someone off of them, I could often just promote someone from within the farm system. I don't know, that wasn't a model I set out to do. It just seemed to evolve into that. And so I enjoyed doing that. It was fun to see these guys' careers take off, and it's very gratifying.
Yeah, hey Steve, what's funny is Steve's pretty close with Jim Lee, and what's funny is like hearing it from the other end when he was a scared little guy, and now he's a big head honcho and all that. Steve, go ahead, Steve, you got stuff to say.
Yeah, I've known Jim for a couple of years now. Had many run-ins with Jim, and the first time I met him, by the way, I slagged off his work on the Fantastic Four, but that's another story. I'm more curious. Obviously, you're in this position. You're doing a lot of this editing and stuff like that. Was there any writing task or challenge or idea that you had for a while, that after a while you had your feet, that you were like, I want to spread my wings, I want to be a little bit more creative here? Did you ever get hit by that bug, and what happened to it?
Multiple times. Well, the first time was with Alien Legion, and I just did not have the time to do a lot of the hands-on work. So I wrote down like a little Bible for the concept, and initially, I would, believe it or not, that was going to be a Marvel title. But then I spoke to Archie Goodwin, who was starting up the Epic Comics line of create our own titles, and it ended up going over there, and that meant I got to work with Archie too, which was a blast. So Alan Zelnitz expanded on my Bible, and Frank Sirocco was one of the people that I knew from California. I hadn't really got a shot yet at the comics big time, so I talked to him and got him involved. And so I would, kind of called it producer, which was a little bit more than an editor. It's, I roll up my sleeves a little bit now and then, go in there and work on that stuff. But then I came up with a property called Shadow Masters, which there was a 4-issue miniseries based on. Those characters also showed up occasionally in the various Punisher titles. With Louise Simonson, I co-created a 6-issue miniseries that most people never heard of, called Spellbound.
Oh,
and what happened is that our crack marketing department decided that this was going to be the first direct-only weekly Marvel miniseries. So, and if you know how the way the retail business works, that means by the time the first issue went on sale, they would have already had to place their orders from solicitations for at least issue 5. So, and that means they were automatically doing their usual thing. Okay, if I ordered this much for issue 1, I got to cut it by 55%, and then, all the way down. So it didn't matter how good the comic was.
Right.
It was not going to do that well. And then there were other things here and there I didn't really have time to do. But I did enjoy helping others develop their new titles. When Louise Simonson came up with Power Pack, she asked me to edit it, which I was flattered by. And she had discovered June Brigman. And June had never drawn a monthly comic before, but she could draw kids really well, which I don't know if you guys realize this, but most comic artists, even the really good ones, draw horrible looking children.
Wow.
So, but June had spent a couple of years like at a major theme park in Georgia, drawing portraits of kids, not caricatures, but actual representational portraits. And so she could draw them really well. And so she got her start there. And then years later, when she eventually decided to branch off and do other stuff, Louise Simonson was in my office. We're trying to figure out who to get to take over Power Pack, because the people we'd occasionally have do fill-ins like Brent Anderson and so on were busy. I had Brent busy on Strike Force Morituri. But there was a guy that came into the offices to show his work around. He showed it to some other offices, but they didn't have any work for him. And while I'm having this meeting with Wheezy about who we're going to find to replace June Brigman with on Power Pack, in walks this guy and asked me to show his portfolio. And I look at it, it's nice, but it's nothing I really need right then. And as he's closing the portfolio out from his little side pocket, slip out a couple pieces of paper with some great drawings of kids on them. And that's the start of John Bogdanov's career. So things like that happen all the time. You mentioned earlier in the opening about Strike Force Morituri. I don't know if you guys realize this, but believe it or not, it was the first title that was supposed to be a New Universe title. The original concept of the New Universe was that as long as they weren't, if they were new, they had to be new properties, and they couldn't be in the Marvel Universe, but they didn't necessarily have to be interacting with each other. So Strike Force Moratorium was the first of those, and eventually Jim Shooter evolved it into being, it should be a cohesive universe. And so it ended up becoming its own title under the Marvel line. It was never really clear whether it was actually part of the Marvel Universe or a Watcher, alternate universe story or whatever it was. But by that point, word had gotten around the creative community of the troubles that were happening in the Marvel Universe. And so those guys were very happy to be out of there. But you're talking about, too, I have very eclectic tastes. And as you can tell from my line, I was editing, at the same time I'm editing Punisher, I'm editing What the, Rocket Raccoon, Solomon Kane, Power Pack. I had a short adventure anthology book for all called Amazing High Adventure. And the Gargoyle, Defenders, Hulk. I like variety. So it was fun.
Yeah, it's funny you say What the. That was great too. Like almost, I remember that was like a little breath of fresh air for me too back in my collecting days. Almost like like the Nut Brand X stuff.
That's what I had great fond memories growing up reading Nut Brand X. So the idea of reviving it. But then Mark Grunwald, I think, said, let's give it a different name. I think Mark came up with the name What the. Another little story about that is, I think it's in the first issue. You'll see there's a story penciled by Steve Ditko and inked by John Severin in What the. And Ditko would occasionally come by the offices and visit now and then. And the editor said he knew a bit, and I knew him a bit. He'd often stop by and visit. So when I was starting What the, I'd known Ditko had done humor work in the past, particularly for, I think, Cracked magazine. Mm-hmm. And Wally Wood's Wits End magazine. And so I asked Steve, this is our new self-parody magazine. Would you like interested in penciling a story? And he goes, only if you're making fun of villains. I don't believe in making fun of heroes. So I asked Mark Grunwald to write such a story, and he did. It was kind of a parody a bit, tied into Secret Wars. And I think he was a little worried about catching flack for that from on high, so to speak. So he used a pen name, Gwen Dibley, which was an early Monty Python name before they chose Monty Python. Yeah. So Ditko penciled it, and I had Severin ink it. And I was in hog heaven. That was great. They've got people like Russ Heath that, remember those ads for toy soldiers?
Yeah.
Russ Heath drew some of those. And he did this really famous one of the Revolutionary War. Yes. And so I had Mark Seary, who was an assistant editor at the time, write a parody of that ad. That was for a toy set of street gang hoods in New York. And Russ included one of those Revolutionary War toy soldiers in the side shooting his musket at this gang on the side, but we just had a blast with that story.
I remember that. Yeah. Okay. What I want to ask you about, obviously you were holding at that time when the Punisher was literally, I don't know if he was in more comics than Wolverine was or vice versa, but that he was just literally everywhere. And I know Steve has a little tough time with that anti-hero right there, but I have to know, you were kind of leading Punisher's destiny. You were kind of at the forefront of that. So, but before you go into that, obviously, you have to speak of that, and you got to go 6 and 7 of Punisher War Journal. I just have to see the making of that. I'm sorry, but you're going to live and die by those two comics. So I'd love to know all about that and getting the job of leading the Punisher.
Early on, when I was editing, Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck approached me with this proposal for the original miniseries, and apparently they'd been rejected by a number of other editors so far. But I like the general plot, and I really have always loved Zek's work. So I said, sure. Some of the other editors thought it was nuts because he's not a real hero. He's an anti-hero. He's doesn't have any superpowers. He doesn't use fantastic weapons. And I thought it was nuts. But it ended up being a huge hit. And so we did the Punisher regular series after that with Mike Baron writing and Klaus Janson doing the art. One of the things about those issues that if you go back and look at them is one of the things Klaus did, he not only penciled and inked them, he colored them. And that was the days when the reproduction was just god awful, like basically printing on toilet paper. And Klaus would alter his color guides and the coding on them, keeping in mind what it was going to really look like when it was printed. So his approach has a unique look to it if you go through his books. But then I started getting all these ideas for Punisher stories, but there was no real outlet for it. Mike didn't need me feeding him ideas. He had plenty of his own. And the book was doing so well that, I thought maybe it could support another one. But, I was editing full time. I was recently married, starting a family. I just, the time for me to do it was really not there. So I proposed it and I said, if you do it on a 6-week schedule instead of a monthly schedule, I can write it and do the layouts and I'll get somebody to do the finished art. And Jim Lee was drawing Alpha Flight for me at the time. And he and I were having a phone conversation. He was living, I think, in Berkeley at that point. And I mentioned to him, I was going to be doing Punisher War Journal, and I was going to, I was not trying to get him to do War Journal. I was happy having him on Alpha Flight. I thought it was looking great. But he said, I'd be interested in that. So no fool I stole from myself and found somebody else for Alpha Flight. But that really took off too. And when it came time to do the first crossover, the first meeting between Wolverine and Punisher, the genre convention for the two kind of anti-heroes meeting like that is usually when they initially meet, they clash, and then they find there's some common cause or common enemy or something, and they end up having to team up, if somewhat reluctantly, to do that. So the trick, as the saying goes, is to give the audience what they expect, but not the way they expect it. And I was reading 2 books about Africa at the time. One of them was about this couple that was searching for a live king cheetah. King cheetah is a rare form of cheetah that's a little bit larger, has bigger splotches, and has 3 solid stripes down the back. And there were pelts of them in museums, but no one had seen a live one in a long time. So they would fly in this giant hot air balloon over the savannas looking for this cat, because big cats hardly ever look up. They don't have to worry about predators and high. And they eventually find them somewhere, and now they're bred selectively. It's like an albino. It's a very recessive trait. So they're bred now. If you look up king cheetah and compare it to a regular cheetah, you'll see the difference. But then I was also reading a book about Roy Mackall's expedition. He's a scientist into the Congolese swamps to search for a reported small sauropod dinosaur. In theory, the Congolese swamps are the one place on the planet where the climate has remained relatively unchanged since the days of dinosaurs. I'm not sure who figured that out or why or how, but that's the theory. So if there was a place they were going to survive, that would be it. And there are reports that come out, and every once in a while, an expedition goes in there, and of course they get tantalizing clues, and they get close and, get some photos, but they forgot to focus or some such thing. So there's never really any solid proof. But so the idea occurred to me that, Wolverine would get involved if he found out there was a ring of people selling the pelts of endangered animals.
Right.
The Punisher, things just got so hot for him in New York that he couldn't stay there anymore for a while. And so Microchip knew the scientist that was leading an expedition in the Congolese swamps, and they needed a security man. So they sneaked Punisher out of the U.S. and he's in Africa for a while, working as a security guy. And that was the rationale for that. And I wrote them, did the layouts, and Jim did the finished art on top of those. And boy, I wish I'd held on to those originals. But it was just a big hit, and it's been since then. It seems like almost every other year or so, Marvel finds a new way to reprint that story. I get a little check with Mickey Mouse in the corner.
Yeah.
Because the reprint fees for a lot of it aren't very high.
My quick question though is, since it's kind of funny how Wolverine and Punisher never teamed up. Did that just occur to you, or did that come from upstairs, or that you just said, "Hey, I'm going to do this"?
I was surprised no one had done it before me, and I ended up doing the second crossover too, which was a 3-issue series called "Damaging Evidence" that Gary Erskine did the art on. Which one of the main villains was this character I created called Damage that had first appeared in War Journal. But you were talking earlier about the Punisher character. I mean, I have my own reservations about the character. In fact, when he first got popular, all the other editorial offices wanted to guest star him, and so in theory they're supposed to pass their plots in front of me to make sure they're doing it properly, but they didn't always do that. And the Punisher is like a 2-dimensional, or at most a 2.5-dimensional character, which ironically, those are harder to screw up than a 3-dimensional character. And I had an outlook on the character that I tried to keep when I was either editing him or writing him. But there's a policy at Marvel that's usually an excellent policy, where if you're on the editorial staff and you're writing or drawing a book for Marvel, it has to be edited by somebody else, and somebody else that you have no oversight over. So they have an independent thing, which generally speaking works really well. That's one of the things I wish a policy should have started, and I wish he'd actually followed it himself. It would have saved us a lot of grief. But the only person I had room on their schedule was the one editor that was up there at the time that I felt was pretty much clueless. They'd been promoted when they shouldn't have been promoted, and they didn't have a grasp on editing comics in general, much less this character. And so they were letting a lot of other things happen, and things being established with the character that I did not agree with. To me, like, the character is a cautionary tale of what happens if you let vengeance take over your life. And he's not someone to be emulated. He's miserable. Nothing gives him real satisfaction. Once he finishes a job, it's just on to the next one. He's basically, consciously, he's taking on all these violent criminals that are avoiding law in order to save other people from experiencing what he experienced, because his family was killed by the mob. Subconsciously, or maybe somewhere in between conscious and subconscious, he has a death wish. He knows if he keeps going after these violent people, at some point he'll be killed or maimed and pay the price he should have paid for failing to protect his family. It's that simple. And so even though I really didn't want to come out and say that in any book, anything I was editing and anything I was writing pretty much tried to follow that. This other editor was just letting people do whatever. I mean, there were things being established, like, the Punisher had his own, he had a torture chamber in his warehouse that in his downtime, first off, he has no downtime. He's obsessed. In his downtime, he hunts bear, and he's a member of the NRA and all this other stuff. And I was like, that's how I got this gray hair. I just got so disgusted with it that, I don't know if you remember the last page of the first issue of War Journal, I have previews of all these storylines I have coming up. I only got to maybe half of them, and I got so upset I quit the book because I couldn't deal with this guy anymore. And when I really wanted real editorial input on the story stuff, the first 3 issues, the real story editor on those, uncredited, was Ralph Macchio, because I wasn't getting any real editorial input from this other editor. Ralph did me a favor, and he read the plots and gave me his feedback on it, because I craved getting real competent feedback on the stories. So if you like those first 3 issues, you can give a nod to Ralph. But these days, in the years that have followed, a lot of different people have taken on the character, and I've read very little of it because I just got kind of soured on it. But then I saw stuff happening in the news and stuff, like there were some police that were using the skull as an emblem, and the last thing I want my cops to identify with is a vigilante. Jesus Christ. That is so friggin' awful. And then, even some military people were adopting it, which maybe I can see a little bit more, but to me, the only military that should ever be identified with the skull is the goddamn Waffen SS. And I do not want anybody in my military identifying with the SS. And if you think about it, it's like one of the things that really did well for the U.S. in World War II is wherever they went into, even in conquered territory like Germany or Japan, the GIs were generally very friendly and administered medical care and distributed food and all this stuff. And how do you think those people would react now, with someone with a friggin' skull on their uniform? It just makes no sense to me. I don't know what those soldiers and what the commanders of those units is thinking. But I get myself in trouble with some of the far right people when I talk like this, because they figure if I was the Punisher guy, then I should be like all for all this stuff. And to me, he's a very simple character who's easy to screw up. And I really wish they'd go back to the vision I just outlined. It would be much better.
Well, I think it's sort of ironic that you're here on this show with the biggest Punisher hater in the world, which is me. However,
Is that always been the case?
Always. I don't believe the Punisher should have existed in the Marvel universe. I think he should have been killed in issue 1. Spider-Man should have broken his neck by mistake. But I like to look at things in a larger context. And I remember the #1 issue of the Punisher limited series when it came out, and there was a whisper, and people were like, "Hey, have you seen this book? This is a big deal. This is breaking new ground. This is like wow." And it was 48 pages, and the art was Mike Zeck.
Yeah.
But there was a feel to that issue. It wasn't your typical happy-go-lucky Marvel book. It just had a different feel. And I was relatively, new to Marvel. I'd only been reading comics for about 3 years. But even I was like, wow. And then all of a sudden, the character began to become more popular. And then everyone's like, hey, do you have Amazing Spider-Man 129? It's like, oh, no, it's impossible. It's gone. So I was able to observe how this character slowly but surely began to become more popular. And when I was working behind the counter of the various comic shops that I worked in the early 1990s, people would come in and I would say, okay, you on a subscription list? It's like, yeah, all Punisher. Anything else? Nope. You don't want to try? Nope. Punisher. Everything else is crap. And I was like, wow. I said, you're not even going to try one. And I remember a lot of the people who were, the Punisher War Journal, they were furious with the Wolverine thing. They're like, that's stupid. And I was like, it's a comic. And they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. That stupid superhero stuff. And I was like, wow, there seems to be this dynamic of people who love the Punisher. They love their guns. They love their urban stuff. And I remember Mike Barron got into trouble. He did a story where there was some sort of demon in there. And in the letters pages, people were furious. And he actually made an apology and said, okay, guys, we're not going to do that anymore. I'm going to just give you brutal urban, boom. So for me, and my job as a retailer is to try and get you to spend more money. I was never able to get Punisher fans to expand beyond what they read.
Did they go for where he was guest starring in other books?
They would begrudgingly, and they would hate the other characters.
I look back now and I can't believe it. We actually guest starred him in an issue of Power Pack. It was a very gentle representation. But,
he was even in Archie too. He was even in Archie.
And of course, he was on the Spider-Man cartoon where he was firing the webs.
Yes.
Well, you know what? They called me up. Marvel Animation called me up and asked me and said, we want to have the Punisher guest star on the Fox Saturday morning animated show, and we want to guest star the Punisher, and you're the Punisher guy, but you can't kill anybody. And I said, and if I remember correctly, the rationale was that the Punisher wanted some special favor or something from Microchip, and Microchip says, all right, I'll do it, but you got to promise not to kill anybody for 48 hours or a week or whatever the hell it was. So he could only use non-lethal weaponry during that episode. I think they asked me to write a Christmas. Marvel used to do these Christmas specials.
Yes.
And they asked me to write a Punisher Christmas story. So again, I think I might have used that same thing where he was under an oath or whatever not to kill anybody during his time. So I had him do all these things where, set up these things where the bad guys were basically hurting themselves by attacking him, with him being passive about it. It wasn't easy coming up with some of those scenarios.
Well,
I don't know if you remember.
By the way, that has remained in my memory forever. I think it came out in 1994, and the point of view is you're looking out from the view outside of a gangster's mouth, and the Punisher comes in, and the guys, he's in a dentist's office, and the Punisher's like, "Oh, glad you," straps him down, and then one by one pulls his teeth out.
Oh God!
Okay? So you see him, he's pulling these teeth out, and I was like, wow, have we really got to this level? And in the end, the guy, you keep hearing this screaming, and in the end, he's just got some gums there, and there's some blood. And then he finally tells him the information, and the Punisher puts the gun right in his mouth, and then blows him away. And I remember thinking to myself,
I don't think you would see my editorial credits on that issue. No. But
then again, I just remember thinking it takes a lot to shock me. I mean, I was in the army. I've been all over the place. But that one there, I was like, I think they've gone too far right now. And the people who are shepherding, who are in control of this franchise, are really making a mistake. Of course, the good news for you, Carl, of course, is that they've just recently gone back. They've taken his skull away. He's going to be wearing a little pink dress pretty soon. They're completely taking him away. And a lot of my friends who are Punisher fans, I can hear the wailing and gnashing of teeth. And I'm laughing. And they're, they got tears in their eyes. They're taking my Punisher away. They're taking my Punisher away. But no matter what anyone says, the amount of money pulled in from the Punisher franchise, is amazing. A lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of people, were able to feed their families and get things going on all the profits on the Punisher. Okay. And that there, is, some of the work that you did to get that thing off the road. And it's a very, very successful franchise. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah, Carl, I don't know if you ever, where they did the Punisher good, there was two. Did you ever see the Superhero Squad when he guest starred? When they were like, they're those funny looking, and they actually did the Punisher really good because he was in a van with all the superheroes and he's telling people when the time comes.
Someone sent me a link to that just recently. I wish we had done that in What the.
Yeah, it was actually done very well. He was kind of very dark, and all the other superheroes, it was almost like being in a haunted house when they were in his van and they were all scared. But I thought that was cute. But Steve, to go back what you were saying though about the Punisher, you got to give his popularity had to come from remember you were talking about that limited series. Mike Zeck's art was what I think, because remember all the posters, and remember it was like every single cover was a poster. And I remember that, and they were in every single comic shop, especially at that time. even when you went to these little holes in the walls, they had that he's with the gun with the bullets thing or the dread posse. You always saw that. So I mean, just so you know, I mean, like it was Carl. I mean, you had him when he was at his biggest. Like he was in all the video games. They were using all those covers. I remember that the Punisher video game for Nintendo. You just blew people away. That's all it was. It was like it was just. Steve, believe me, I understand why you don't like the Punisher. The Punisher was you could only take him for so long, and it like you kind of always ran into these dead ends because it always kind of ended the same way. He had to die. Like that's a character that.
Well, we finally got the end result of what, you know, a lot of Punisher people consider the perfection, which was the Garth Ennis story where it was not even part of the Marvel Universe. It was something by itself. And it was ultra violent. And there was no superhero stuff at all. He was just, you know, killing people in the most, you know, inhumane way possible. And
right, right.
You know, and it ran and ran and ran. And, you know, people were very, you know, were into that, you know, but I think that a character works very well outside of the Marvel Universe. I really do think, you know, it doesn't, you know, for me, it just never worked because you know, during Civil War, there's where he meets Captain America or whatever it is. And, you know, Captain America's like, you know, well, you know, you shouldn't be doing this and doing that. And he's like, well, I respect you. So I'm you know, I'm not going to shoot you. You know,
did you at least like the appearances of the pulverizer and what the?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
But needless to say, no matter what anyone says, you know, as someone who does, you know, worked retail and did restocking of back issues, you know, Punisher War Journal, Punisher Warzone, all those limited series, whatever it is, it's a franchise unto itself, which it just keeps churning because there is an audience out there that loves to read comics, but they're not into superheroes. Okay. Yeah. And they're like, I want to read something else, but I like comics, and the Punisher is their vehicle. I'm reading this comic.
That to me, Laurie, is why it would have been important to have the right editorial control to keep that franchise going and to grow it to have like, I was hoping to do like a Shadow Masters monthly book that would be part of a little group of books that would be in that little corner of the universe where it's more like non-superpowered type street action kind of thing.
Yeah.
I still have some ideas for the character. I don't think they'll ever have me write. I don't know if you know that about 4 or so years ago, they asked me to write an issue of What If, and it was like, what if Peter Parker had become the Punisher? And boy, did I have to try and figure that out. So what I do is I did some research, and apparently there's in Europe there's a spider called a false widow spider, which is venomous, and on their abdomens they have these markings, and on a lot of it looks very much like a skull. So I have that be the spider in the lab that gets irradiated and bites Peter, and that different venom, more toxic, alters his personality. So he ends up going down that road.
That sounds like a nightmare issue for Steve. Peter Parker and the Punisher.
Well, it's more likely for you since you're a Peter Parker maniac. I can imagine, but yeah.
But I might have another issue idea for that. I'm not sure to go there. But I also have a Punisher Shadow Masters like miniseries idea I'd like to do. But they've been so reluctant to have anybody do anything with the character unless a whole collection of executives gets together and decides that this is what they'll do and that's what they want to do or whatever. Well, which is a drag, except it's probably better than letting a lone wolf editor that's clueless run with the character.
Well, are they going to continue on with Punisher? Because I know, like last month, it was basically like they were done with the character.
No, that character's done. Like he's a different thing now. He's like a cosmic thing now. That they're not.
There's
Punisher
like some
doesn't
demon
work
or
for
like beast involved now,
well,
right?
I think what will probably happen is he'll go into limbo for a while, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. But money talks. And all it's going to take is someone to come back and go back to his roots and do a story which is like
that
hardcore.
Yeah. The guy down here.
Yeah, they can invite someone back and they say, look, we know we made a boo-boo, and it's been 5 years without the Punisher. We have to reintroduce the Punisher to the universe again, and we want to, fix some things and do things. It's going to happen because it's a money-making machine, and I don't care how angry people are. They love money.
Yeah.
I liked some of the Netflix show stuff, but they did some things too that made my skin crawl. Like there's a scene in there where the Punisher is running around a hospital going after somebody. He's firing a shotgun in a hospital. Jeez. And then later on, he's got Daredevil chained to the roof. He's like interrogating Daredevil, and there's that little shed on the roof, which is the top of the stairs to get access. And somebody's trying to come through, and it turns out it's the superintendent of the building trying to do his job, figuring out what the noise is up there. And the Punisher's holding the door closed, and he's got his gun drawn because the guy insists on coming up there like he's going to shoot him. And, the guy's just doing his friggin' job. And the only reason that he backs down, Castle backs down, is that it turns out that the guy on the other side of the door is also a Marine veteran. If that's the only reason, if that's what the reason it takes you to not just shoot an innocent person, then, see, that's the kind of stuff I take issue with.
Yeah. Oh, God. Before I give it to Niall, I just have to say that the cover that got me when I was a little kid and why I got so into the Punisher was that Daredevil issue. Steve, you remember what's the number that Daredevil, like he's shooting Daredevil and it's like almost coming out of his back?
Oh, that's issue 184.
Yeah, I never saw a superhero get shot like that before. Like, that was kind of radical. I think Frank Miller was
that's the Angel Dust story.
I'm just saying, like, that cover instilled the Punisher in my head because that was so radical. That now he kills everybody, he blows up the whole world.
And beautiful, iconic moments. The cover to Captain America 241 is an iconic, beautiful cover. I mean,
you never saw that. Like he's on Captain America's shield, and like you're like, oh my God! Like I remember that. Yeah, that was like huge.
When I quit the book and the character, I basically ignored what anybody else did. So I'm afraid I didn't really see that stuff. I just, every once in a while, someone would mention something to me, and I'd roll my eyes, and I just.
Go ahead now. Oh,
now with Alien Legion, I know there was a lot of rumors going around for quite some time that the screenplay was going to be adapted. Is that something that is still potentially in the works? Could we see that on the screen, or did it end up dying off?
Well, for I'd say a year now, every month I've been told we'll have the deal squared away in a month. So it's been going on for about a year.
Okay.
We're down to one last piece of paper that needs to be signed, but there's some issues that need to be worked out. It's a very complicated deal because it was at Bruckheimer and Disney's for a long time, and they let that lapse without going into physical production. But so that, in theory, that meant it would revert back to me. This is after they had it for like over a decade.
Oh, wow.
They had half of Hollywood rewrite my screenplay, and 3 of the drafts were done by David Benioff, a Game of Thrones fan, who's a big comics fan. In fact, he said he grew up in Brooklyn, an Alien Legion fan. That made me feel good. Also made me feel old. The Bruckheimer people wouldn't let me read the stuff until they felt it was, there. So a director who was interested in it did read it, and he told me it didn't work because it sounded to him like Benioff was being directed by the Bruckheimer people to turn Alien Legion into a science fiction Game of Thrones instead of Alien Legion. And the director wanted to direct Alien Legion. So I just went through all this stuff for all these years. There were at least 7 different screenplays written after mine. I don't know if mine will ever get made. Probably not, because most big studios, like if they are going to sink 100, 150 mil into a project, they want it to be written by someone who's got a track record of writing hit movies. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter if you're the guy that created it or the guy that knows it the best or whatever the qualities of the screenplay are. So we'll see. I'm hoping it'll move forward soon, but after next month, nothing going on forever. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah.
Keep your fingers crossed.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. I know we got to wind down and all that stuff, but before I give it to Steven to wrapping it up, but what do you think? Alien Legion meets the Punisher. What do you think? That's ever going to happen?
I hope not.
That'd be an issue, though. That's good. Go ahead, Steve. Winding it down. Any last words for Mr. Potts?
Carl, it has been an absolute pleasure. I love hearing this, deep dive into the history and being in the office and meeting certain people. And now that the show's been going for a while, we now can corroborate so many stories and hear the same, from different angles. So I want to personally thank you for coming on the show. And giving us that beautiful firsthand history, putting some pieces together, putting a little bit of the pieces together for us. It's been an absolute joy, and I'm honored to have you on the show.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And now,
yeah, same as Steve. It's an honor. Never thought I'd have a chance to talk to you, but here I am, hanging out with you, which is great. And thank you again for coming on. It truly is an honor. And unlike Steve, I've really enjoyed the Punisher. And that's just how it's going to be, Steve.
You should have been at the Comics signing when that What If issue came out of. What if Peter Parker had become the Punisher?
Yes.
I'm going to mail Steve 20 copies of that every week. But I'm actually in the middle where Steve doesn't like the Punisher and Niall did. I always liked the Punisher, but I never really collected them. I got those Daredevil ones and the limited series, but I never really got. I think I got the first part, like the first series that came out, and I never really. I got obviously the 6 and 7, but I never really collected the Punisher because the thing about the Punisher is like you can go away from the Punisher for years and you can just get right back on him and kind of like start right up and go, you know where you're going to start and you know where you're going to end. So, I mean, it's just awesome to know that you're synonymous with him. I'll always love the Punisher though. As a character, I did like him. I just don't know really how Carl, I have to ask you, when the Punisher started having that tail, remember he had the tail and it got so long?
I stopped way before that. But one thing I wanted to say too, I forgot, is that I don't think Archie Goodwin gets enough credit for the Punisher. If you remember, like up until there were 2 black and white magazine stories with the character Archie.
Yes.
And I really think that reset the character from the days of, the early Spider-Man appearances and so on, where he was kind of a joke in some ways. And then I'm guessing that's what influenced Miller for the appearances in Daredevil. And that's also what I think that influenced Grant. And I know it must have influenced Joe Duffy. Joe Duffy wrote the very first Punisher graphic novel, which was simultaneously in production at the same time as that first miniseries was. It was drawn by Jorge Zavino, who just did amazing work. But she worked closely with Archie, and I think that she must have read those, and it must have, molded what she did in that book.
Yeah, but so who was the person that gave the Punisher some Vietnam vet? Why would he have this long tail that got so long that out of the 90s that drove me nuts?
I think
who's responsible.
There's certain things with some characters, and the Punisher is one of them, where like I said, he's basically a 2.5 dimensional character. So people flail around trying to figure out what to do with them. And so the cheapest, easiest thing to do is to do something more extreme or more flamboyant. And instead of trying to boil it down to the core of the character and seeing what happens when you examine that. And that's my last word on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I would just like to say, though, while we're still talking about Punisher, definitely one of the best action figures. When those 1990s action figures or so came out, he was like a cap gun. And you'd put the little thing in there, and you'd hold his machine guns, and you just flick the back, and I still have mine.
This isn't the Punisher, but I'll part with one final story. This dark side with the glowing red eyes, I don't know if you can tell, there's like a prism that goes down.
Yeah.
The light shines on the eyes. There was one of the escapades we had at Marvel was that after Tom took over running the company, after Shooter was let go, the mood at the company had been pretty dismal for a while. And I wanted to do something that, showed that the fun was back. So I'm an avid fisherman, and I brought in my travel fishing rod that was broken down in sections, and it had really basically an invisible monofilament line on it. And the 10th floor where Marvel was at, the editorial offices, was rare for New York. The window is actually open. And so I took that into Ralph Macchio's office, and he had one of these dark side things, and we put it on the end of the line. And so 10 stories down, we have dark side kind of bopping down the street next to the pedestrians. And someone occasionally trying to go grab it, and we yanked the pole up, and there was an awning there, and it looked like he just disappeared. And we had a blast doing that. And then people were coming in and out of the office and seeing us too, and everybody thought it was fun except for the office manager, whose last name was Aaron Wright. I called her Aaron Third Wright, but she was not very fun. But she thought what we were doing was horrible. So she got to Mike Hobson, the publisher's office, and she goes, complains about this horrible thing we're doing. And so Ralph's door opens, and there's the publisher, who I didn't know very well at the time, didn't know what sort of guy he was. And he goes, "Boys, what are you doing?" And so I very meekly, reel everything and disassemble all that. And Mike says something, "I'm going to go down and talk to DeFalco about this." So Ralph Macchio had been doing it a lot too, but at the time Mike came in, I was the one with the pole at the window. Ralph was. So I'm waiting for the rest of the day to be called down to Tom's office and taken to task for this horrible thing I've done. So 5:30 comes around. I still haven't been called down. So I go down to Tom's office and I said, "Tom, was there something you wanted to talk to me about?" He goes, "No, what?" And I go, "Did Hobson come down here and say?" I goes, "Oh, yeah. He came in, closed the door, sat on the sofa and said, 'You know what those guys are doing?' And Tom goes, "What guys?" He goes, "Potts and Macchio." And then he starts to tell it. He starts howling with laughter. Hobson's howling with laughter. So that's when I knew like the culture that we'd had before things got dark for a while had returned, and that I was working for the right guys.
That's good. That's awesome.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl, for being on here. Obviously, we're going to have you again, and I can't wait to see you at more shows and stuff. Hopefully, look at that! Look at that! The sauce is
the
coming.
Invasion's coming.
Yeah. So, Steve, why don't you get us out of here? Thank you, Carl.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Boom!
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.